Recording progress.
Cool. Carry on.
We good? Cool. All right, so moving into it, we'll start with this. Again, not a writing prompt, but just opening discussion, right? What do we already know about labor history? Drop in the chat, like maybe an event that happens like in the 30s or 40s or 50s, or maybe in the 2010s. You know, that's history. We are part of history, right? What are significant moments in labor history that you think might show up today? Or maybe you think I might miss in this very brief overview of a long and deep subject, right? What do people already know about, right? And the bonus question is if you can tell me what this is a picture of here. All right, y'all, I know we are not starting from square one. I know y'all have some labor history in y'all's heads. I think I've seen people in previous labor history classes before. Yeah, just anything that comes up, or tell me what this photo is. Does anyone have a guess of what this photo is? We had some good guesses in the last class. Guys taking a pic. Yeah, you would be absolutely correct about that. These are some guys taking a picture. We still do this today. History repeats itself. A railroad. Yeah, totally. Getting some echo here. Yeah, this is a railroad. Okay, yeah, Trevor, bingo, right? The original union that started the IAM, right? This is the beginning of your union right here. So this is a picture, very lovingly called, this area is called the Pit, right? This is the birthplace of the International Association of Machinists on May 5th, 1888, in an engine pit in Old East Tennessee, Virginia, and Georgia RR shops, which was a long title, which maybe was misleading, but this was in Atlanta, Georgia, right? So on this date, 19 rail workers got together to talk about how they might fight for better rights, better conditions in their workplace, right? And this was all the way back in 1888, which is, almost 40, 50 years before the signing of the National Labor Relations Act, which we'll talk about. But the main thing that means is that these men did not have the right to organize. They were not protected from retaliation. They were risking a lot to kind of get together, right? And more generally, the history of labor was a lot more violent, a lot more agitated, a lot more militant before the National Labor Relations Act kind of created these processes that we ideally abide by nowadays, but as we'll see, maybe not always, right? So very brave act for these men to come together and organize in their own interests, right, against management, right, against the people who owned the company, the people of the ruling class, right? So yeah, I think we'll just jump right in. And I just want to start by saying that it is really difficult to place the beginning of the American labor movement, right? A lot of people think that the first unions are the beginning of the labor movement. I would agree. I would argue that they are misled by that because it's helpful to remember that American labor, the history of this movement, is much more than just the history of unions. It goes back way before a lot of those first unions were kind of put in place and recognized, right? Because wherever in history there has been a class of people employed by a more powerful, wealthier class of people, we have seen instances of workers organizing collectively to better their conditions. This is what people do. If they're being, exploited, if they're being put in bad working scenarios, they're going to fight back. We see it all throughout history. And so we can understand the beginning of labor history, for example, to be right here, right? The beginning of America itself. And as we know, the infrastructure of the US was built on stolen land by stolen labor, which is the labor of enslaved African people, right? And while labor history has historically not been so great at considering action by enslaved people to be part of this history, there are shortcomings all in academia and the ways that people, talk about the history of labor. There has been a movement amongst historians for a long time now to recognize these early slave revolts as important examples of workers fighting for their rights under horrible, horrible conditions, right? This, of course, has been long discussed and advocated for by Black scholars to understand that this is part of our labor history, right? But academic institutions, as we know, have often been slow to that sort of progress, have often failed to think of these revolts as early examples of early labor organizing, which they very much are, right? It's crucial to understand this, to understand where we are now, right? How work evolved, how the value of free labor evolved. And a lot of these revolts, also including Black and white workers, enslaved people and indentured servants, colonial elites, we're trying to keep these people divided. But we see that through struggling in the arena of labor, we see very early examples of cross-race, cross-class solidarity. And I think it's a history that we can look back and be inspired by, even in the worst of conditions. And these people very much did not have the right to organize, as you might imagine, right? So early on, we see that race is a tool to divide people, right? In the early days of the colonies, enslaved people and indentured servants sometimes shared solidarity with white workers who were in similarly horrible conditions, right? They both understood that these conditions were their exploitation at the hands of elite landowners, right? And so examples we have here are the Nat Turner Enslaved People Rebellion in 1831 in Southampton, Virginia, which is pictured here in this political cartoon, right? The Stono Rebellion in 1739, which happened in South Carolina. You can see over here a sign describing that revolt, right? And Bacon's Rebellion is a really interesting one. Not the prettiest history, right? But I'm wondering, does anyone here know about Bacon's Rebellion, maybe just by name, or maybe a little bit more about it? Yeah, just shout out if it rings a bell. So way back in 1676, this was one of the first instances of Black enslaved workers forming solidarity with white workers in a common interest. Unfortunately, that common interest had to do with removing Native American people from their land in order to, push back against the interests of this this land owning elite, right? So it's kind of a complicated, complex, interesting history here. Not the most honorable kind of scenario, right? But I think it really gets at the complexity of these dynamics between racialized and white workers, in the United States, all the way back, in the 17th century from the very beginning, right? Definitely encourage you all to look more into it if that kind of piques your interest. A really significant moment in labor history that I know I wasn't taught about in school, and I know that I only really begun to understand once I started teaching labor history, right? And as y'all might imagine, there might be very specific reasons why labor history is not more common in schools. It might be, maybe a little dangerous, right? So happy to provide it here. But between 1800, actually this number is wrong. I need to change that. But suffice to say, millions of enslaved workers uprose and they ran away or refused to work, right? Definitely a fascinating and very important history to remember. Moving forward a little bit. Yeah, so more on early American labor struggles elsewhere, right? Exactly. So much history is just not showed to our kids, right? So the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the early 1800s, right? We have a new working class. It completely transforms the way that work is done, not only in this country, but all around the world, right? Workshops where you typically would have had artisans creating one thing their entire life. People would have known them to create that one thing. Very specialized skills, This became distributed into these factories where people, just became a lot more automatic with the way that they work. This changed our relationship to work. It made it that work became a lot more monotonous, right? And a lot more efficient. But how do we think that this shift in how we worked kind of affected the everyday worker? What did it look like for them now that they're working in factories and maybe not in like a mom and pop workshop? Well, maybe we can ask this question. These names that are listed right here, industrialists or robber barons, they were called. John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, Henry Ford. Do these names ring a bell? I'm sure y'all have heard these names before. Does anyone want to tell me? Yeah, more shift work is one example, right? Yeah, kind of more mechanized. But I'm curious, when you hear these names, what kind of comes up for folks? Like, do we have negative associations, positive associations with Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, and Ford? These are huge names, right? Rich, very rich people, right? Big money, more power, right? Yeah, totally. Same thing over and over. That monotony, right? But maybe we keep it simple. Do people think that these are figures that people generally feel positive about or negative about? Definitely simplifying it here. But in general, when people are like, I'm gonna be the next Rockefeller, what kind of energy is that bringing, right? Yeah, could be same of both. You're talking, Rick, are you talking about both of what? Power and money, or yeah. So as we were talking about this in the last class, people were talking a little bit about how, yeah, Henry Ford, we understand him to be the beginning of these large companies, the beginning of these of auto manufacturing in America as we know it, right? Um, One of the earliest industrialists that helped build this country, right? Manufacturing would not be the same without Henry Ford. It's synonymous. His name is synonymous with automation, right? With manufacturing and industrialism. So people see him as, one of the founding fathers of American industrialism, of capitalism, right? Francine talking about J.P. Morgan, right? Carnegie and Rockefeller being associated with the banks, big money. We hear, just one example that I was thinking of was, Jay-Z's record company. It's called, I think it used to be called Rockefeller Entertainment. This image of excess, this image of like, I'm going to make the most money, right? And have the most power. These are generally positive images, right? But these situations were really similar. They very much rhyme with what we're seeing today. We see deepening American inequality, which, as we'll talk about later, very much related to the kind of decline in union participation, the decline in strong unions. And before we had strong unions in this country, because of the Industrial Revolution, you saw people being able to pay people pennies on the dollar for monotonous work and just kind of pocketing a lot of that money. This was the original 1% of America, right? And if you think about it, it wouldn't be so sexy if Jay-Z called his record label like Elon Musk Entertainment or Jeff Bezos Entertainment. Because nowadays we have a little bit of a different attitude to these people, right? We understand what these people having billions of dollars owning that much of America's wealth means for the everyday worker, right? And I would argue that a lot of people that were living through this era understood that too. These people were living in and working in awful working conditions, right? There's no way they didn't understand who it was that was making that happen, right? But as they say, history is often written by the victors. And so There's a lot of sanitization of these folks, legacy. And yes, it's true that the American workplace would not be the same had it not been for Henry Ford creating the first industrialized auto plant. But Elon Musk also created the first AI car, right? Just because it's the first doesn't mean that it didn't create a lot of suffering for the average American, right? So in this picture, we see, I believe that is Carnegie, if I'm wrong. Back then, we had political cartoons, complaining about how these men were hoarding wealth and hoarding it away while people in the general public were really struggling, against this rising inequality. So as we talk about history, really want to think as we go on of how these things are relevant today, how we're still struggling with some of the things that people struggled with way back then, and how progress is maybe not as clean as it seems. This idea that, oh, as time goes, we become more progressive as a society. Yes, maybe we get some victories, but freedom is a constant struggle, right? A dignified workplace is not something that we just get when we win laws. Those laws take enforcement, right? And that is a question of power. Right? So moving forward a little bit, the 1886 Haymarket Affair. Has anyone been lucky enough to check out the site of the Haymarket Affair in Chicago? There's a big monument there. I'm really curious if anyone has visited it. Yeah. So if you end up in Chicago anytime soon, I definitely recommend checking it out. I haven't checked it out yet, but there is a monument kind of describing this very significant event in labor history, right? So this event was the result of about a decade of really active labor activism in the United States. People really struggling specifically for all kinds of issues, but specifically around fighting for the 8-hour workday. The idea was that you would have an 8-hour workday, you would have 8 hours to rest and 8 hours to just be a human, to have leisure, right? And so this one situation, which was a peaceful protest for the 8-hour workday in Chicago, famously broke out into a riot. And what happened might sound familiar to folks that have been paying attention to things that happened in 2020, other instances of police retaliation in crowds of people who are protesting, exercising the right to show discontent as people residing in the United States, right? But what happened here was a flash bomb went off, and it was never identified who threw the bomb, complete mystery. And then the police fired in the crowd in a completely inordinate retaliation against this. They ended up killing a few people, right? And then the crowd just burst out into a riot. And what came of this was there was a trial where I think it was 7 or 8 activists, a few of them anarchists, were sentenced for conspiracy, right, to create this kind of uproar, which they thought might lead to a supposed revolution, right? So 4 of those 8 people were hung famously, and they became the martyrs of the Haymarket Affair, right? Um, and we remember them as not only political organizers in their communities, but also as strong labor activists. These men, George Engel, Adolf Fischer, Albert Parsons, and August Spies, the men who were hanged, they sang the Marseillaise, the then anthem of the international revolutionary movement, when they were brought to the gallows. And moments before the men were hanged, August Spies, shouted some of my favorite last words in my knowledge of history, which were, "The time will come when silence will be more powerful than the voices you strangle today." And just knowing what these people struggled against, just kind of like gives me chills a little bit, right? That you would end your life with such powerful sentiment, right? And then following this, as we see throughout history, we see several rounds of legislation that were enacted as a result of the uproar of what happened here, right? And this legislation helped establish the original 8-hour workday. And as we'll see also throughout history, often these kinds of laws, these worker protections, they start locally, sometimes within a union, sometimes within a city or an industry, and then they kind of expand out to like the state, to other states, right? Maybe they become federal law. One recent example, the Fight for 15 here in Seattle, right? And CTAC actually, that became inspiration for other states, other jurisdictions to create their own raise the minimum wage kind of laws, right? And that was a campaign that was largely run by labor organizers who were working in solidarity with, faith communities, with other community organizations. They understood that that solidarity is what was needed to make it happen, right? And they were very successful at it. So again, an example of it starts somewhere, right? And as we, work within our unions, working within these institutions, I hope it's something that we can remember, not only that it starts somewhere, maybe here in your own union, in your own workplace, but if there's one thing I want y'all to take home from this class is the sentiment that every right that we enjoy today, every piece of language that protects us as workers, protects our families, was not handed to us. It is not in the interest of the ruling class to give us those rights. Every single one of those rights was fought for, and in many cases, people died for those rights, right? So as we enjoy the supposed 8-hour workday, we remember that, right? And remember what it means to push forward for even better working conditions. And one thing I want to name too is that, again, it's not enough to just get the law, the 8-hour workday, for example, right? Who here thinks we have an 8-hour workday in America? Raise a hands. Who here has worked more than 8 hours a day for a time of their life? Francine, raising their hand. Jerry, yeah. It's not uncommon. In fact, it's so not uncommon that in 2023, there was a study that was done recently that showed here in Washington State, workers did an average of 6 weeks of work of overtime that went unpaid. 6 weeks here in Washington State. In 2023, people don't have an 8-hour workday. We had people die for this back in 1886, and we're still fighting for it, right? Yeah, Teresa. Yeah, thanks for sharing, y'all. So my point here, it takes vigilance and it takes constant, struggle to make sure that we get what we deserve as workers, right? That we get that 8-hour workday, that we get paid overtime. And to give you an idea of how endemic this problem is, the past several years, the figure for the average amount of wages stolen from working people through what we call wage theft, whether that's overtime, whether that's not getting your breaks respected, whether that's not getting your vacations respected, it was $50 billion the past couple years on average. That's absurd, right? We could solve a lot of problems with $50 billion. We could definitely be living a little bit more comfortably with some of that money not getting bled from our paychecks, right? So again, history rhyming with what's going on today, right? But for those that are curious, the first 8-hour work legislation came into effect first in Chicago shortly after the Haymarket Affair, and then later in other cities like St. Louis through the AFL in 1888, the United Mine Workers in 1898, and the Building Trades Council of San Francisco later in 1900, right? Okay. So political cartoon here. I just wanted to share with a quote from the then Carpenters Union president, P.J. McGuire. If you want an 8-hour law, make it yourself. I think that rings true today. If you want it, you got to get it. You got to make it yourself, right? So 8 hours labor, 8 hours recreation, 8 hours rest. This was the motto that kind of drove that movement, right? Okay. So drilling it back down to what we talked about at the beginning of class. 1888, once again, IAM is founded. On the right here, we have Tom Talbot, the first IAM president. If you know who that is, I would be extremely impressed that you're very involved in the history of your own union. But he was elected the following year that IAM was founded at the first Machinists Convention, which was held at the Georgia State Senate Chamber. And again, remembering that all this stuff happened before collective bargaining was legal. These strikers, these activists, all these people had to risk everything. You know, this was a massive kind of shift for people, right? And yeah, they put it all on the line. But again, 19 railroad workers met secretly in a locomotive pit right here. The IAM was born, and at the time, riding the trains was extremely dangerous in the US, notoriously so. There were Europeans, there's stories about Europeans who would warn their friends and families about traveling or moving to the United States because they would tell them that they shouldn't trust the trains because the trains sometimes even lacked effective brakes, right? And obviously, even more so, railroad work was even more dangerous, right? Workers would regularly lose limbs, get mangled in the equipment, or even die, right? So when these workers were founding the IAM, their wages were about 20 to 25 cents per hour for 10-hour days, right? And then pretty soon after forming their union, a union that got it done, right? The machinists had won time and a half for overtime, right? And this was well before overtime was a prevalent practice in 1899, right? Well, they won it in 1899, but it was well before overtime became enshrined in like federal law, right? We'll see when that happens much later. And so well before the law required overtime, we see, this kind of worker protection established at the union level. And this still happens. This happened all throughout history. In the 1980s, some of the first protections for the benefits of queer and gay workers, same-sex couples, were enshrined in the contract for the United Mine Workers of America, right? Well before the general public saw this to be something that you could talk about or even bring to like a wider legislation. In kind of a local sense, these workers were able to enjoy protections and benefits that weren't enjoyed by the broader American people until much later on, right? So this is very much something that we see all throughout this history. So zooming out a little bit, another really significant event in labor history that I'm wondering if people have heard about is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. Yeah, pretty tragic event. Does this ring a bell for anyone? Does anyone want to try and sum it up for me? Maybe like a sentence. Emergency exits. Yeah. Were there any emergency exits, Justin? Tell me. Chained? Yeah, Rick, what do you mean by that? Can you give me more? Yeah, no worries, Justin. Because Rick, you're important. You're remembering a very important detail about what happened in this event. So, case in point here, everything that we won as workers, every protection and right, had to be fought for. A lot of these protections come out of really tragic events like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, which spurred people creating an uproar, at this tragedy. 146 workers killed. This was a textile factory with mostly immigrant women and immigrant and women workers. There was some child labor also, being used at this factory. And as Rick said, the story goes that the walls, the exits of the doors, the exit doors of this factory building were chained shut because the employers were afraid that the workers were going to steal the supplies from the building, right, from the factory. So there were no exits. This was also when, fire safety was, not quite as sophisticated as it is today. And so tragically, many of these workers, to avoid being burned alive, jumped out of windows to, I guess, a more preferable death, right? There's newspaper accounts, there's firsthand accounts of people like watching this happen. And the uproar was enormous. You had, back then, these workers were not only working in unsafe working conditions, they also worked 12-hour days and they were paid $15 a week. And these deaths of these workers helped rally organized labor around what would be the future New Deal agenda, what would be protections that would lead up to the legacy of OSHA, in the 60s and 70s, right? But one of the most remarkable things about this event was that we had a massive outpouring of people on the streets in solidarity with the people lost, right, and their families. The estimates go between 80,000 people to 120,000 people, which is enormous. This is well before social media. This is well before you could advertise, a rally for people to come to on Instagram or on Facebook, right? And you had this many people hit the streets, right? Well, that's pretty hard to ignore, right? And that was what solidarity and power could look like back then, right? And still could look like now, And I think it's important for us to remember this history so that we can really kind of get some perspective on how aspirational we might be able to be, especially in this moment of labor resurgence. So some of the first protections for workers, safety protections for workers, came out of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, right? But as we've mentioned, I kind of want to tie this to maybe stuff y'all have been hearing about in the news the past several years, right? Questions about sweatshops. Do we still have sweatshops in America? Yes, right? And maybe there's a reason why it's not breaking news that there's sweatshops, right? This is the kind of these are the kind of treatment that a lot of these workers, because of being disempowered, whether that's because they don't have a union or that's because their immigrant status is at risk should they complain, right? These are the kind of stories that don't often make it into the news because it's not great for H&M or Forever 21 if everyone is really aware of what's happening, right? If I could recommend a movie about this, 2007's Made in LA covers a lot of the sweatshops that were going around on that were active in LA in the mid-aughts, right? And it covers like the challenges of these advocates and these workers creating campaigns to fight for their own rights when often as undocumented workers, they didn't have protections that so many other workers enjoyed, right? And obviously this is a global problem, right? Think of how you read the tag on your shirt that says made in Bangladesh, made in Thailand. A lot of manufacturing, especially in the 80s, got pushed out to these other countries because there was much less oversight over the safety of workers. The labor laws were much more relaxed, right? And how does this kind of rhyme with what's going on, what went on with Boeing in the past decade or so, still does, right? Yeah. Boeing moving manufacturing out to South Carolina. Why did they do that? What's the reason? Was it because the weather's nicer out there? No union, right? Yeah, so really similar to what we see on the global scale, really similar to, yeah, long-term costs, right? Yeah, they're saving pennies, right? Cheap labor, no strikes. I don't know how you got the bigger font, but I'm glad that no strikes is in a bigger font because that's a big deal, right? Yeah, so we still see the ways that these people that own corporations, a lot of management, don't really care if people get hurt. If they can get away with it, as long as they can save some money, make more profit, who cares? Who cares? And especially when people aren't looking, who cares, right? So part of our job as unionists is to create an uproar, right? To make what is a problem for working people a problem for the owning class, right? That's what we do. That's what we're seeing a little bit about with that safety situation that happened with Boeing just recently, right? And I'm really curious if y'all have some thoughts about how that might affect the upcoming bargain, right? Because I know it can be kind of a complex issue, and I think that I'm really curious, but that is probably a conversation for another day, right? But stuff to think about. And yeah, one more point, just if I can make about child labor, right? We'll see later. We have some of the first child labor protections that come about, but just recently, we still have all this news about teens, people under working age getting hurt on the job, getting killed on the job, and corporations really not caring because who cares if a teenager gets killed making chicken nuggets at this factory, right? As long as they can, save their bottom line. The point there being, while we might have laws about things like child labor, we still have a lot of work to do to make sure that we can enforce those laws. And that is a question of the power that we have in our unions, the power that we have in our organizations to make sure that these corporations are not getting away with it, right? So moving on a little bit, I'm really curious if folks are familiar with these people, Eugene Debs and Mother Jones. Maybe you've heard their names around. I know I learned about Eugene Debs at my first job after moving to Seattle because someone there had a dog that would roam the office, and the dog's name was Debs. And so, I don't know. I learned a little bit of history through that dog's name, right? But Eugene Debs, super, super important figure in American labor, right? In the 1900s, again, militant labor organizing across all industries. And in Chicago, Eugene Debs and Mother Jones were two of the co-founders of the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW. Trevor Knightley. Yeah, Trevor, is there anything that you want to share that you know about Mother Jones?
I'll be honest with you. I don't remember too much at the moment.
No, no worries, no worries. We'll catch you up. Great. But the
Thank you.
IWW, this was a moment, a much more militant time for labor unions and workers who understood that they were all the more powerful if they could organize between industries, that what workers at the mines could learn from workers at the railroad, could learn from workers in the factory, right? Strategies, lessons from organizing, coming together to build a stronger movement, through diversity, right? And the IWW is still around. It largely does not have as much power as it used to have, but still carries this spirit of inter-industry working, inter-industry solidarity and work together, right? And it really makes me think of how I feel when I have the privilege to teach classes that are not just to one union, even though I love teaching those classes anyway, but classes where people from multiple unions come to learn, right? Because what happens is that class becomes mostly a container for people to learn from each other. That's what I say when I teach these classes, that y'all know more about your union than I do. And I'm hoping that conversations that you have between each other with the knowledge that comes out in class will make you a stronger union, right? And I feel that way when I'm teaching classes with multiple unions, right? And people are learning, oh, that's how you guys handle grievances. What if we got that into our contract, right? Or, oh, that seems like a much more efficient way of handling this process in a union, right? Things that are highly unexpected because it doesn't serve us to be working, siloed, right? And so I think about how cool it is that I get to work in those environments, how cool it is that we have an institution like the State Labor Council or Central Labor Councils that kind of provide this. But the IWW was, 1,000 times just one class, right? It was highly active, and it was comprised of some of the most, forward-thinking and militant labor activists at the time. So Union Debs, one of the leaders of the IWW, famously opposed World War I. He understood, as hopefully we understand today, that war is a racket. We see that it makes profit for people who are manufacturing things that get sent to war, people that are, moving around game pieces on the international level, and very little of this money winds up in the pockets of working people, right? We see it in World War I, we see it in World War II, we see it today, right? And Debs, being a very principled socialist, felt very much this way, right? And he actually led socialist presidential campaigns, multiple, right? And one here, which is pictured, is a campaign button showing Eugene Debs in one of his presidential campaigns, which he ran from jail, having been arrested after he made a speech in Canton, Ohio, urging resistance to the military draft of World War I. He was arrested soon after and charged with 10 counts of sedition, wound up in jail for propping the anti-war movement back then. So pretty cheeky of him to put out a button with his face on it and without his name on it, just saying, vote for president, convict number 9,653. I would love to find this button at a thrift store or like an antique store one day. I think they're probably worth something now. So yeah, he was a very significant figure, super fascinating figure. Definitely encourage y'all to read up a little bit more about him if it piques your interest. Over on the left here, we have Mother Jones, who was once called the most dangerous woman in America, right? So after Jones's husband and 4 children died of yellow fever in 1867, and her dress shop was destroyed in the Great Chicago Fire, a few years later, she became an organizer for the Knights of Labor and the United Mine Workers Union. And she co-founded the IWW, understanding that it wasn't enough for her to just be working within one union, that she had bigger aspirations for the labor movement, right? She helped coordinate major strikes. She was a very active leader, right? One interesting piece, though, is that she was famously opposed to women's right to vote. She argued that suffragists were naive women who unwittingly acted as agents of class warfare, is how she put it, right? And I think it just goes to show how radical her politics were, even if some of this is not quite savory to our modern ears, right? She distrusted the kind of legislative process, and she saw the more important work to be done within labor and within workers' organizations, right? So in the same time period, just to give an idea of how huge these these actions were, the Bread and Roses strike is one great example, happened in Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1912. Bread and Roses, this really beautiful kind of slogan, which is saying, yeah, workers need bread, but they also need dignity. They also need roses, right? They also need reasons to live outside of work, art, community, places to enjoy their lives. And as we know, awful working conditions don't just affect us at work, they affect us elsewhere in our lives, right? And so this is the kind of sentiment they were bringing out to the streets. In this photo, we see that everyone participated. This child carrying a sign saying, "A little child shall lead them." Really beautiful sentiment. Yeah, at the time, we had textile workers who would open their pay envelopes one afternoon to discover that their weekly wages had been reduced 32 cents because of a new law that went into place in Massachusetts. That was the kind of beginning of the Bread and Roses strike, the moment that spurred it on. These were workers that were only getting paid $8.76 per week, and every penny was precious. So 32 cents often made the difference between going hungry and not going hungry, right? So they took to the streets, 23,000 men, women, and children, 20,000 on the picket line. These are absurd numbers when we're talking about today's kind of labor activity. Not to say that there's not plenty to celebrate in the past several years, these really huge events that are happening with UPS, UAW, with the writers, with Amazon and Starbucks the past several years. But come on, 23,000 people on the streets, no social media. People really saw what it meant to how important it was to prop a strong labor movement because they understood that it affected everyone, right? Yeah. So unfortunately, the Bread and Roses strike did not win their closed shop that they were fighting for, but they did get a 15% pay raise and a promise of no retaliation. And beyond that, they set a precedence for widespread labor activity, and they became part of this legacy of early union activism of this scale, right? So drilling down a little bit to what was going on in the IAM at the time, right? Some important dates. This picture here showing some of the first women that were admitted to membership with equal rights, which happened in 1911. And as we'll discover more, unions and organized labor have had a long history of exclusion of women, of Black people, brown people, racialized people, of queer people, right? And so it took work to push against this, right? Unions were not always perfect, still aren't today. We're still doing that work actively. I'm sure you all know, right? But in 1911, women were admitted into the ranks of the IAM, you know, and I think that we should, as so many people throughout labor history and more broadly civil rights history have understood, we should understand that labor is a site for struggle across these barriers, and it's a site to push forward, better treatment for marginalized people of all sorts, right? Because what do we have in common, so many of us, is that we're all workers, right? And so a lot can happen in the halls of labor. Some other dates: 1903, the specialists were admitted to membership. Another drive independently in the union as other stuff is going on around the country for an 8-hour workday. Of course, again, labor unions are not existing on an island. They are feeding back into the broader movement for things like an 8-hour workday, and those movements are feeding back into labor. You know, there's kind of this loop that creates momentum for power building for working people, right? In 1905, apprentices admitted to membership. Around then, 769 locals within the IAM, bumping up pay for a 9-hour workday from 36 cents to 43 cents. You know, hey, it was progress, right? In 1915, they do win that 8-hour workday, and so many of these shops and factories, they end up affiliating with the International Metal Workers Federation. Then auto mechanics admitted into membership shortly after. And then we see kind of just like this upsurge, right? This growth, steady growth with IAM membership reaching over 300,000 workers by 1918. And a little bit about local labor history. Really interesting subject. There could be a whole class about this, right? The Seattle General Strike in 1919. Does this ring a bell for anyone? Has anyone been on the underground Seattle tour? They talk about it a little bit. But in general, not just in Seattle, not just in Washington, this was a strike that was felt all across the country and all across the world, right? This was one of the first, I believe it was actually the first general strike in the United States, meaning that all workers from all industries just chose to not work, right? And they were doing it in solidarity, you know, largely organized through unions, with 35,000 shipyard workers who had walked off the job in the first strike across all industries, right? This was tied to a lot of the strikes that were happening in World War I. These were workers that were denied the kind of benefits that they were promised after the war. You know, once the war had ended, they had been lied to, they realized. So people struck in solidarity. And there are fascinating stories. You know, there's newspaper accounts, there's firsthand accounts of people walking out in the streets and hearing silence, right? Because nothing was running, right? These machines were all shut down. And instead, what they had were streets of people spreading education about labor rights, feeding each other, you know, setting up impromptu kitchens, soup kitchens. It was a beautiful show of community and solidarity for around 2 weeks before it was finally squashed by state forces, right? And obviously, the point of the strike is to slow down the economy in some way. So they didn't want that. But this was 1919. So beyond the economy kind of shrinking for the time being, what else happened around this time? Just 2 years before. Out in Russia, we have the Russian Revolution, the communists kind of taking over the government there. There was a huge sentiment that kind of spread around the world after that, especially in America. This first Red Scare, where they thought, 1919 general strike, this means that people are going to revolt. Like the American version of the Russian Revolution was going to happen right here in Seattle, right? So it was really important that they stopped the spread of communism right here, right then, right? So one avenue that they took to was the media. Definitely rhymes with what's going on today. I'm sure that y'all have thoughts about this as well. But there was the city newspaper, and then there was the independent labor newspaper, right? That were spinning completely different stories, right? And city and state forces did everything they could to shut down that newspaper. So they shut it down because they understood media to be this vessel for very dangerous information. How might this resonate with what we're experiencing today? How has media changed, and how has media kind of stayed the same? What is the importance of having a relationship with media as union activist, right? Rick saying how often the media is in bed with big power, right? Yeah, people with a lot of money. Yeah, it's pretty disturbing to think of what all is all too easily hidden from us, right? Any other thoughts? Well, I don't know if y'all spend much time on YouTube, but I do find myself on, labor YouTube sometimes on that algorithm. Just watching labor news, people talk about, strategies and stuff. And pretty much every time I'm watching a labor video, right in the sidebar and the recommendations, for every video that is pro-labor, for every, uh, informational video, there's one spinning disinformation, there's someone who has pulled all the right strings to make sure that there's a video telling everyone watching that video that labor unions are actually not good for the working people, right? And if you're, new to this stuff, if you're just curious about it, that can be really powerful propaganda. So still, the narrative wars, the media wars continue now in a much more accelerated and dystopian pace, right? Yeah, Rick's saying it is sad you have to go outside U.S. news to get real news, unbiased story, right? Yeah, you truly do have to hunt it down, right? And a whole class on I would love to take a whole class on media theory and the ways that the American media have kind of functioned in relation to power, right? But this is a really potent example of it. The ways that shutting down the media around the Seattle strike helped make it get silenced, right? And put out, right? But it did last for 2 weeks. And the legacy of the strike was that it was a huge source of labor activity that spread inspiration to kind of solidarity strikes and similar strikes, general strikes that were happening elsewhere in the country, right? People, often when strikes happen or, big events like this happen, people will often pose the question like, was it a success? And, maybe they didn't win all the things that they wanted to win. In fact, they didn't. But that legacy is long lasting, right? And in some ways, I think a little bit more important, right? That we saw people inspired by it immediately and still today. Just want to recommend real quick, if y'all have some time and you're curious about the Seattle strike, how it was received during the time and how people have written about it since, really great resource through the University of Washington's archives, their labor archives. are really cool, really unique kind of institution, but really important, especially in Seattle, especially in Washington, a place that has a strong current of activism, of progressive kind of labor, um, you know, efforts and struggles, right? You can check out this website to find like, yeah, newspaper stories and people just talking about what the strike meant, at the time. So contemporary to that, in the IAM, a few years later, we see the effects of the Great Depression, right? Obviously felt in every workforce, but for the IAM, it looks like membership cutting down to 70,000 people, right? This was felt widely. We also saw attacks on labor, because every time labor makes all these gains, all these wins, people with wealth, people who don't find labor to be in their best interests will push back, and we should expect it. 1932, Congress passes the Norris-LaGuardia Act. It bans the use of court injunctions in labor disputes, largely defanging a lot of these efforts, right? And in this period, the Great Depression, nearly 30% of union members are jobless, right? So it's kind of interesting because you see a lot of people kind of fall out of the movement, but you also see throughout history often periods of time where people are struggling the most is when people are moved the most to fight back. I think we're still seeing it today, right? This culture shift, going on the decades before, and especially the generation that I grew up, millennials living through the 2008 recession, the COVID pandemic, the housing crisis, and a very deep knowledge of the 1%. I've been hearing it since I was very young, right? So hopefully that cultural shift means something, means something big, and hopefully we can all be a part of it. But some good news, moving forward to the 1930s, the 30s and 40s largely seen as the peak of labor activity in the United States, which is sort of controversial. Usually what people mean when they say that is that that is the period with the highest union density. But as people have pushed back on me when I have brought that up in classes before, labor activists and organizers have always been fighting, whether or not they had the numbers, people have always been putting in the good work, right? And in 1935, we see the passing of the National Labor Relations Act, or the NLRA. Probably the most significant thing about this is that it secured our rights to organize for all the people that were covered by the NLRA, which is to say most private industry workers, right? It created worker protections from retaliation, so it became illegal for corporations to retaliate if people are talking about organizing. But it wasn't perfect. And so when I say that most private sector workers were covered by the NLRA, there was also a group of workers that were covered by something different that was put into place, something called the Railway Act. And so the Railway Act covered specifically agricultural workers, railway workers, and domestic workers. Can anyone take a wild guess about what it is about these workers that they all share in common back then and largely now? Maybe some additional information is that now airports are part of the Railway Act. Totally, Teresa, nail on the head. Minorities, immigrant workers, right? These were largely fields that were worked by Black workers and brown workers, right? Workers in the immigrant sector. And still today, the airport got kind of grandfathered into the Railway Act. Something about the justification being, oh, this is like big transit in America, right? So we're just going to lump them in. Also, I don't know if you've been to the airport recently, but most of the workers we're talking about are immigrant workers, right? So still today, almost 100 years later, we're dealing with a racist piece of legislation, right, that has gone largely unquestioned. And because of this, farm workers have had to start independent unions, and have done so much through those unions, right? despite not having protections to organize without retaliation, despite not having the same protections around minimum wage, despite not having protections around things like hours, or even things like child labor. You know, there's a lot of child labor that goes unseen in the agriculture industry, right? And so when we say the NLRA gave us the right to organize, we should remember that us is not all of us, right? Also, just another detail too is that there is something called the FLRA, which is the federal version of this, which covered federal workers, still covers federal workers. But yeah, I think that there are some workers even in the public sector that don't get all of the same protections that we enjoy in the private sector largely. So yeah, Rick's saying that is why both parties in office won't fix the issues with immigration, why they don't want it fixed too much money and power, right? Yeah, I think that these parties, as we're beginning to understand more and more as history kind of spells itself out, have quite a few things in common, right? Yeah. So another piece of legislation, a move in the positive direction. Oh, real quick, I just want to name that protections from retaliation, while we have it enshrined in law, it doesn't mean that we don't have corporations pulling stuff all the time, right? Amazon exposed over the past few years so much for anti-union, breaking anti-union laws. So things like union busting in very threatening ways, discouraging people from forming their own union, things like just like horrible safety conditions in their shops. And again, this is a question of power. The reason they can get away with this is because workers are living precarious lives. They might lose their jobs if they choose to organize. That this is something that people have gotten away with for forever. It is the status quo, right? So never mind that it's illegal. Never mind that we have a law about it. It's not until we make it a problem for corporations that we can actually push back in a real meaningful way. And often organized labor is that vessel for pushback. One example of how it's shown up too, I think it was like a few years ago or last year, Elon Musk tweeted something pretty snarky about people trying to unionize at Tesla. He said something about how, yeah, let them start a union. I don't really care, but just know that blah, blah, blah might happen if they try to start a union. So in a legal court, they were able to identify that as a threat, which is plainly illegal. And so he was forced to take the tweet down. But it just goes to show how easily people kind of get away with stuff like this. And without getting pushback, you know, they will continue to get away with it, right? So in the late 1930s, we see in the IAM, the first industrial union agreement between the IAM with Boeing here in Seattle. And, you know, talk about the connection between legislative politics and unions. They endorsed the very pro-union FDR for president, right? Especially as he was gearing up to bring in more New Deal policies and more pro-worker policies, right? And leading up to the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act, things that you should remember about this, it outlawed child labor, right? These are the first laws that did this federally. Never mind that we still have child labor happening in this country, right? Again, law and then enforcement, right? A question of worker power. It provided overtime pay. It put a floor on wages and a ceiling on hours. These were the first federal overtime pay laws, you know? And again, this is like, I think almost 2 decades after overtime was enshrined in the IAM at the local level, right? So an example of how our unions can often be, you know, shining the light in the dark, right? These highly progressive forces in American society well before the rest of the country kind of catches up, right? But with great pieces of legislation like the NLRA and the Fair Labor Standards Act, we have, of course, pushback, which we'll get to on the next slide. But let's celebrate the victories real quick. So the 1930s, just in 5 years, right, we see working people, both employed and unemployed, farmers and the elderly, winning these victories. Social security, unemployment insurance, public assistance for poor families, minimum wage and overtime pay, all largely from not having federal protections around any of this stuff at all, building up from their unions, right? Regulations around child labor and child welfare, right to organize their unions in a strong labor movement, securing bank deposits, regulation, right? That is the role of unions largely, is to regulate financial industries, to regulate corporations, but also financial industries, and then protections for ownership of homes and farms, right? In just 5 years, right? This is what a strong labor movement looked like back then, and it's what it could look like, hopefully now, right? Rick saying, looking at Boeing, South Carolina website, if you want to see an anti-union ad. Yeah, totally. You don't have to look very far. The internet is rife with them, right? To varying degrees of legality. But if you have the morbid curiosity, yeah, I'm sure that's an entertaining watch and a disturbing one, I'm sure. In the 1940s, we see a further increase of the labor movement's density, right? We reach the peak in the 40s and 50s. So this is the largest amount of workers organized within unions at that point, around 35%, which is just wild to think of today. We are far from that number. A huge wave of strikes after World War II. A lot of workers coming back from the war, finding that the economy had shifted so much, that the workforce had shifted so much, having to kind of contend with the fact that now there were so many women who were not previously employed in these industries, who have taken those jobs as part of the war effort and who weren't just going to go away, right? And so there was a lot of a culture shift to contend with, and a lot of worker kind of discontent. So people getting together, realizing that the source of this discontent was not that these women were taking our jobs, but that these corporations were still treating us horribly, resulted in, the large amount of strikes that came out of World War II, right? For IAM, 76,000 IAM members, kind of bumping up after the Great Depression years. But 76,000 of them serve in the armed forces, the total membership being over 700,000, right? Around this time, we also have the merging of the AFL and the CIO, and this influenced a lot of US legislation around workers' rights, right? Yeah. Another really important piece of legislation, as I was saying, with every gain that we get in the labor movement, without fail, there's going to be pushback. We should expect it, and we should learn from history, because it's not going to stop. And one big one was the 1940s, the Taft-Hartley Act. Yeah, so this was known, begrudgingly by labor leaders of the time as a slave labor bill, quote unquote. They called it a new guarantee of industrial slavery. It was bad news. They saw the writing on the wall. What this act did was it restricted the National Labor Relations Act. It allowed states to pass right-to-work laws outlawing mandatory unionship, right? Union membership. This is something we're still dealing with today, right-to-work states, closed and open shops, right? It outlawed sympathy strikes, which was a huge hit. Sympathy strikes meant that you could strike in solidarity with another industry, right? Another union. Often these industries were tied to each other in some kind of like industrial moneyed way, right? So they understood that they could block the flow of money by doing sympathy strikes. So this made those illegal, right? Which largely defamed the labor movement at the time. It also made it easier for employers to oppose union organizing, weakening a lot of the protections that came with the National Labor Relations Act. And beyond this, we see, this comes in during the height of the Second Red Scare, right? During the Cold War. So the Taft-Hartley Act also required oaths from all union officers. It required them to state that they were not members of the Communist Party, right? Unfortunately, many of these leading labor organizers were members of the Communist Party. They were leftists that understood the connection between worker struggle and a more like international struggle, right? And a way to imagine a different America, right? So a lot of these workers had to hide their status. I'm sure y'all are familiar with the Red Scare. I'm sure you maybe know a little bit about like people in Hollywood that were blacklisted, people whose careers were ruined. But it wasn't just movie stars, right? It was people who were leaders of their unions, who were who had to go into hiding, who were persecuted, right? One figure who I think is largely forgotten by history, I think it's a real shame, is Paul Robeson. He always felt like someone that I would benefit a lot from learning more about in school. But his career, he was like a Renaissance man, and his various careers in athletics, as a movie star, as an activist, as a writer, were derailed because he had to hide his status as a leftist, right? So yeah, pretty unfortunate event. We're still very much dealing with this. The ways that a lot of these strikes are illegal today. It stays in place. But in the 1940s, we also see organizing across lines of race, kind of reaching new highs, right? And in many ways, largely because this figure right here, A. Philip Randolph, and the brother and his forming of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in 1941. Yet another figure that I think I would have benefited a lot from learning about in school, but I didn't. So he was one of the forefathers of the civil rights movement. He was a confidant and a mentor to Martin Luther King, right? He actually organized the first March on Washington, not to be confused with the March on Washington that MLK helped to organize later on. The first March on Washington actually didn't happen, but just the threat of a March on Washington created a situation where legislation ended up getting passed. There was an executive kind of piece of legislation because FDR was so pressured by these organizing efforts. He brought in Executive Order 8802, which banned discrimination in the defense industries during World War II, which was huge for Black workers, right? Being left out of this industry that was booming during the wartime effort, right? So the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters was a union of mostly Black people, right? It was the first Black-led union. What sleeping cars are, they're kind of like above ground train cars, kind of like the not the light rail, but the streetcar that we have here in Seattle. But back then, they were mostly stewarded by Black men, immigrant workers as well, right? So A. Philip Randolph, understanding that organized labor was a site not just for struggling for workers, but also for the rights of Black people, for these civil rights, basic rights for people to exist in this country, right? He understood those to be connected, right? And he saw organized labor as the key to building a broader movement, right? So he helped found this union. Eventually, pressure from this union and other unions in solidarity brought forth a Civil Rights Act, an early one, which promoted fair employment, federally anti-discrimination policies in federal government hiring, which was huge, and ending racial segregation in the armed services, as we mentioned before, right? These were huge victories, which happened at the intersection of the fight for racial justice and organized labor. Very much rings true with what we saw in 2020, people getting retaliated against for wearing pins in support of the protests that were happening in mourning of George Floyd, right? There's still very much a connection between race and labor, and there's still very much a struggle within labor to undo a lot of these attitudes of exclusion and to create spaces for people who have historically not been represented to get more access to tools to build power and advocate for themselves in the workplace, right? And then another side note, in IAM, 1948, membership open to all workers, regardless of race and color. Just remembering that it wasn't always the case that unions were at the forefront of social change. In some cases, they followed it, right? This federal legislation happening before it happened kind of at the local level, right? So I think it's important for us to really contend with the ugly history that exists in our unions and let it inform us as we continue this work, right? More about immigrant or minority workers in the 1960s, jumping forth a little bit. We had a huge strike from the UFW, the United Farm Workers, who organized in California in 1965, creating solidarity between Filipino and Mexican farm workers, largely to protest inhumane working conditions, right? They organized a strike against these grape growers in California to protest poor pay and working conditions, right? And here in this picture, we have two of those leaders, Cesar Chavez and Larry Itliong, who was a Filipino labor organizer. And not pictured was also a very significant figure, Dolores Huerta, whose name you might recognize. It's a fascinating story. But one thing to point out is that this campaign raised public consciousness about the plight of farm workers, who again did not enjoy the protections that so many other workers have, right? And because of this campaign, boycotts began to be more understood as a viable and powerful tool for labor all across the country. This campaign spread boycotts all across North America in solidarity with farm workers. People refused to buy these grapes, and it hurt the pockets of these corporation and landowning people, right? So through this effort, they were able to raise public consciousness, change the culture around immigrant worker struggle, make it more visible to the American public. And they ended up winning labor contracts with higher wages and improved working conditions, and set forth to build the union for future generations, right? So definitely a really inspiring story in general, definitely an inspiring story for me as a Filipino in labor, and just very fascinating story. So zooming out a bit, some of the victories that we saw in the 50s and 60s, we see, as we talked about, civil rights acts getting put into place, voting rights acts, pushing against discrimination and exclusion, largely from the halls of labor. Anti-poverty programs, open housing, educational opportunities for people of color, working class people, poor people, and people with criminal backgrounds, right? Environmental victories, we see that happen coming in tandem with the New Deal policies, right, under FDR. Safer workplaces, we see the beginnings of OSHA, these kind of protections that we take for granted, right? These things that we ought to hold people in compliance with and often fight to. And in 1966, IAM members had 5 strikes across major airlines. And this broke a limit on wage increases, right? Which was a huge topic back then. It helped them win contractual seniority. So the seniority that you have in your contract starts here, right? As well as the medical coverage. If you're curious, if you ever read through your contract, you can remember, okay, it's the 1960s. It took that long for us to get that in the contract, right? But in the 1970s, we see what many call the decline of American labor. Of course, that might be a little too simple to describe what was happening. Of course, people were fighting the whole time, right? But we had the PATCO strike that happened in the 80s. I'm wondering if anyone here lived through the PATCO strike. Maybe they saw news about it on TV. It has been really interesting to get to meet people who have that sort of perspective. Does anyone have memories of living through the PATCO strike that they'd like to share? Anyone want to tell me what it is? So the PATCO strike happened in 1981, where over 11,000 airline workers that were air traffic controllers went on strike, right? They were facing, economic difficulties. They were not seeing the benefits of the much purported Reaganomics, right? This trickle down money that was supposed to enter the pockets of the working class. They were not seeing that happen in actuality, right? So they went on strike, and in one fell swoop in 1981, Reagan fired over 11,300 striking airline workers. And it was a huge blow to the labor movement that was felt for years and years after. I believe we are still kind of contending with the way that this demoralized our movement, right? Because it set a very dangerous precedence. It set a precedence that the United States president could make a decision so so large that could affect so many workers in one fell swoop, right? And this didn't happen out of thin air, right? This happened after decades of anti-labor presidential administrations, right? A long shot from FDR's very pro-labor stance. There were 3 recessions that happened at the end of the 1970s that saw rising inflation and rising unemployment. And we also see a growing corporate influence in politics. I'm sure that y'all have seen this, in your lives, the ways that corporations seem to have more and more say in what happens in the halls of Washington, right? Citizens United is one example, right? Corporations are people, right? Is a sentiment that we got shoved down our throats, you also saw, similar to what we've been talking about, corporations globalizing in this period, corporations taking manufacturing to other countries where they could get cheaper labor, where they could get away with worse working conditions ultimately. And with this growing inequality, which very much has a correlation with a decline in union membership and participation, as we'll talk about soon, we see the decline of the middle class, right? So workers, bleeding deeper and deeper into poverty, and and falling further away from this American dream that we saw glimpses of in previous decades. And then IAM, we see victories and also defeats, right? Not in a vacuum, right? As we've been saying, wins the biggest back pay award in history in 1971. More than $54 million for 1,000 members locked out illegally by national airlines. This is huge. The IAM in this period being a very powerful union to be able to do that, right? And 1982, a year after Reagan fired all of those PATCO workers, IAM membership begins to drop, right, to 82,000. And we see these several years to follow to be years where union membership declines and declines and declines, right, as Reaganomics grips the nation. And there are many theories as to why this might have happened. A lot of it has to do with, these multinational corporations having influence in Washington politics. It has a lot to do with the decline of the middle class. And it has a lot to do with a lot of anti-union propaganda, a lot of it not being, perpetuated in the media. This image of like union thugs and corrupt unions that just take your money, how union dues are just another way to bleed out your paycheck, right? This is heavily on the rise during this period. And we have a whole generation of people that grew up in this culture, not understanding what it meant to have an organization to ensure that you have a dignified working place. So as we were saying, there's a deep correlation between union membership and inequality. As union membership declines, we see income inequality increasing, right? This is pretty stark, right? If you look at the data right here. And this is kind of an old graph. I think it's been updated since. It goes, it totally tracks, right? And does anyone have an idea of why this might be? Maybe that's an obvious question, but I would love to hear anyone kind of reflect on that. Well, I would say that it has a lot to do with, okay, Rick's saying CEO and board members getting paid up, right? Yeah, more of that money going into their pockets, less of it being seen by everyday working people. But I would say that specifically with the unions, like it has a lot to do with the role that unions play in regulating work, right? And making sure that that we get more of that pay, that we get more of that cut. If the company is getting more and more money, we should be seeing more of it, right? At the very least, we should be seeing more than we get, with the amount of money that people are living with, right? And we've only seen it increase and increase in my lifetime. That's for sure. But yeah, right on the nose, Rick. There is an updated version of this chart that I've been meaning to put into the slide deck. This number has gone over 300 since this survey was taken, right? But back in 2015, it was the fact that CEOs were making 276 times more than typical workers, right? This compensation ratio being really just kind of baffling, yeah. And as we've said, this inequality is very much linked, or at least correlated to, dips in union membership, right? Dips in union participation. So hopefully, with what we're seeing with labor's resurgence, we're seeing a challenging of this. And hopefully it means that we can regulate inequality from the ground up and make sure that that money goes where it belongs, which is in the pockets of the people who make this country run. But some good news, as y'all, I'm sure, are aware, past 10, 20 years or so, we've seen labor's resurgence in this country, right? I think that there are a lot of theories about this, but just personally, again, living as a millennial in this country, growing up through the recession, through COVID, through periods of high inflation, through, just like an awareness and a knowledge through the culture of inequality in the American 1% that was not so widespread for, Gen X's generation, right? It's a reason why labor is looking pretty young these days. There's a lot of people like growing up wanting to get a piece of the action, wanting to see what kind of change they can make right here at the ground level, right? And so some great examples in this period, one of them being the teacher strike that happened in 2018 and 2019. It was called Red for Ed, or the Red State Terror. And this was because despite it being really hard to unionize there, teachers went on strike in a lot of the countries in the American, or a lot of the states in the American South, right? Despite the kind of pushback, right? And they went on illegal strikes, right? A lot of strikes that were made illegal through some of this legislation that we've been talking about. As public sector workers, they didn't have that protected right to strike, but they took the streets anyway, and they were successful. And it kind of brings that question up, like, why were they successful? How could they get away with it if it was illegal? I think it's the same question as why can Amazon get away with it if it's illegal? It's a question of power. These are workers that understood that if they had enough people on the street, if they had a strong enough campaign, then it didn't matter if it was illegal. They couldn't arrest all of them, right? And so they were largely successful in their unionization efforts back in the late 2010s, right? But in total, 500,000 workers went on strike in 2018 and 2019. Pretty unprecedented, at least for my lifetime, right? Really wild. Obviously, we have Amazon and Starbucks being some of the most visible kind of examples of this, kind of motivating people to see in themselves, some ways to contribute to the movement, some local actions that we'll show pictures of too as well. Yeah, so Starbucks locally, people rallying in front of the headquarters. Yeah, I'm sure y'all are very aware of that. We also see the Roosevelt High School teachers who went on strike. This was last year, right? They had a sort of militant wing of these teachers who were pushing for harder and harder reforms. A little controversy about that contract, but I think a lot of lessons, right? And a lot of power built and kind of relationships built, that are still ongoing. We also have the homegrown workers that went on strike just here in Seattle, a largely young workforce organizing through Unite Here, organizing this workplace for the first time. pushing for things like better ventilation. I think one of the things that they won was, I believe it was like an extra like $3 to $5 per of pay per hour if the temperature in these workplaces got above a certain temperature. That's huge. That's a safety provision, but it also means like a lot more money in people's pockets, right? So yeah, really inspiring to hear about. And as we've said, labor kind of approval of unions in the United States has been at the highest percentage than it has been since 1965, right? So 71% of Americans now approve of labor unions. I wonder if this number has shifted since the last time I checked it. But this number is up from 64% before the pandemic. You know, a lot of these workers kind of realizing how precarious life can be through the experience of living through such a horrific time, right? And across the board, workers realizing that at the very least they have the opportunity to make more money through unions, right? Like across the board, as we'll see, unions yielding higher paychecks, right? Across industries, across lines of gender and race. Yeah, it's a simpler truth, right? But this kind of momentum has not yet shown itself in participation in unions. It goes to show that we have a lot more work to be done, a lot more work changing this culture in this country. And it really starts with all of us, right? As an educator, I take this really seriously, but also there's a lot of kind of everyday education that happens between workers, between IAM members, between people at the same job site. Yeah, so we have a long way to go. Hopefully, we can use history to kind of inspire what this might look like, right? Just some more data of what it looks like in Washington State, the kind of growth of labor activism. Look at its spike from 2006 on, right? Really stark. We're seeing it in some major cities, right? These are newly organized private sector union members and the upsurge of them. It was taken back in 2022. Some of these slides were actually previously for to show like the purpose of unions. I think y'all are all here because you understand that there is a difference, right? At least in earnings. But these are some numbers showing what it looks like, at least in the building trades across the board, and then across gender and race lines. The union difference exists, right? We know beyond, the more important issues of creating a strong movement that will resonate throughout the country and throughout history, we're also getting more coin, right? Which is nice. But that brings us to today, right? And the moment that we have at hand, right? Responding hopefully as well as we can to this upsurge in labor activity, this moment in the labor movement, right? And it kind of brings me to a couple questions I'd like to close out with today, which is based on what we've talked about in class, I'm wondering if people have any idea personally or maybe big picture about what unions' roles are in helping to solve the problem of inequality in America. How can unions benefit and change this issue of inequality in the United States? I'm thinking, what does it look like in your workshop? What does it look like? More big picture, all of it. Any ideas? Gives a voice for the people. Totally. Yeah, thanks, Trevor. Equal everything. Right, right, right. So yeah, pushing back against inequality starts with pushing back against inequality in your own union. And maybe having conversations with people in other unions to see what it looks like for them. And maybe we can reach the highs that we reached back in the good old days, where we saw tens of thousands of people out on the street who all understood this, and understood the roles that labor has in reducing inequality, right? And so I think the last question I want to ask is, what work still needs to be done in your workplaces? What can it look like for us to push back against, inequality or just any of the kind of anti-union sentiment that is still kind of existing, especially with folks within IAM who are still reeling from the last contract bargain? What are we telling folks to kind of get them to shift their mindset and yes, mourn what happened before and learn from it, but recognize that we're in a very important moment right now with the contract bargain coming up. What can we do? Jerry says band together. Yeah, absolutely. Starts with conversations, right? Yeah. Preach solidarity. Absolutely. Easier said than done. Reminding people that, it's no question it's going to be hard, but it's never been easy. And all the more reason to fight back to win protections and fight for those protections and win more dignity and fight for that dignity. So with these questions, I hope you carry just some of these thoughts with you. And I hope that some of the stuff we talked about today resonates not just in the sense of like a historical curiosity, but also in the sense that it might inform the work that you do tomorrow, right? And reminding everyone of Trevor says, reminding everyone of the past, present, and future workers, right? Yeah, I think we study again history to remember what it looked like for people, the struggles and sacrifices they made, but also the great highs that they achieved through that struggle. And maybe we can see it in ourselves, and maybe we can see it in our current movement. Yeah. Cool. I'm going to leave my email for anyone that wants to just shoot me a question or comments, concerns, ways that this class could be better. Also, again, if y'all have any ideas about things that would be really beneficial to learn about ahead of this contract bargain, we literally exist as a labor center to provide that support. So please don't hesitate to reach out and shoot me some ideas. Yeah. Thanks for the comments, y'all. Very lovely to have everyone here. Yeah, I agree with David. Everyone needs to really look at this next contract and think about what it might mean. Yeah. All right.
Good job, James. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for being around, everyone. I'll catch you next month. Bye, everyone.
All right. And in this meeting, 3, 2, 1. Bye-bye.